welcome all of you who are attending this webinar entitled The New Prevention and Accountability Resource, a Guide for Congregations. We're glad that you have joined us. I am your host, Nancy Kauffmann, an interim denominational minister for church safety for Mennonite Church USA. Our presenter tonight is Michael Danner, who's the Associate Executive Director of Church Vitality, and the person who has given a lot of time and leadership for developing of this resource document for all of us. There have been other persons who have been involved, but Michael is the overarching leader for helping us get this document in place. Tonight's gathering is webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat. Spanish interpretation is available using the global button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive the link in a follow-up email. Our webinars are also available on our YouTube channel, but they are also available on the resource page in the Safe Church website. Please feel free to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen, and only Michael and I will be able to see your questions. We will also answer some of your pre-submitted questions as time allows at the end of the seminar. So let me offer a prayer and then we will begin the seminar with Michael presenting. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we acknowledge you to be the center of our lives and of our work. So we open our hearts and our minds to you. Bless each one present as we all desire to strengthen the health of our faith communities and preventing abuse within. We say all this in your name. Amen. Michael?
Amen. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, everyone that's on the webinar. It's good to, although I can't see you, it's good to engage you tonight, and thank you for your interest in Safe Church and abuse prevention, and also for your willingness to think about how to dive in or jump into this resource. As you know, or may not know, I guess, at the MCUSA Delegate Assembly this past July in Greensboro, North Carolina, the delegate body of Mennonite Church USA passed an amendment to the MCUSA bylaws that states this. It says, all congregations belonging to an MCUSA area conference will utilize the current version of the Prevention and Accountability Resource as approved by the MCUSA Executive Board in consultation with the area conference ministers as the guidelines for pastoral ethics, abuse prevention, and abuse response for all pastors, ministers, and or ministerial leaders in the church. And so they passed that has been done, and it's now part of church life. The question now is, now that we have this resource, now that it's been put forth for use as guidelines in the church, how do you do that, or what does that mean practically speaking? And so that's what this webinar is designed to address, and that's what it's all about. How do you jump in, or how do you begin to approach this as congregations and congregational leaders? A few things before we jump into the resource itself. First, it's always important to remember this, that as a congregation, you are responsible for abuse prevention in your congregation. Your policies and practices are the first line of defense, and creating a positive atmosphere, a healthy atmosphere for your congregation to thrive is your responsibility, right? That's not something we can do from a national office. It's not something your conference leaders can do on behalf of your church. You all are tasked with those responsibilities in your church. Those responsibilities include guidelines for members and participants in the congregation. For instance, what is acceptable behavior? How do we relate to one another? What do we do when there isn't when things aren't going well. Your responsibilities include supervising credentialed pastors, ministers, ministry directors, youth ministers of all sorts. So anybody that's credentialed, it's the congregation's job to supervise them. It's your responsibility to do that. Also, you're responsible for supervising non-credentialed persons who serve in pastoral ministry, maybe have a pastoral title, but they're not paid. Maybe they have a ministerial role, but they're not credentialed. You supervise them as well as a congregation. And you're responsible, finally, for the supervision of all lay persons who work with children, infants, nursery, teens, and vulnerable adults. All of this comes under what it means to be a congregation when it comes to abuse prevention. So that's your role. The second thing I would say is that the P&A resource, the Prevention and Accountability resource, when you read it and when you go through it, you will notice that when it comes to congregations, the word recommendation comes up a lot. I had somebody ask me this recently, is why is on the congregations does it say recommendations, but with the conferences and credentialed leaders, they may seem more like rules. The reason is because of our polity within Mennonite Church USA. And so when talking about congregations, these are recommendations because Mennonite Church USA has congregational polity. And that means that local congregations have autonomy when determining the when, where, why, and how of ministry, programming, and those kinds of things within your congregation. The current version of the Prevention and Accountability resource serves as a guideline, and the bylaws actually state that this is how they're to be used. They're guidelines for you. They're recommendations on how you can do this work. What that means practically is that they are there for you. And I think they do provide a basic foundation for creating a healthy congregation and also pathways to follow in the event that there are misconduct or misconduct related allegations or things that happen in the church that you might need to attend to. But they provide you with the framework for that. But you will notice that the Prevention and Accountability resource is not exhaustive. And so what that means is that you may encounter situations and circumstances in your church context that are not specifically mentioned in the resource, right? Our response to that is not to continue to add more policy to the resource, but to simply, I'll just say this. In those instances, so if you come across something and it's not real clear, in those instances, pick up the phone, go to your computer, send an email, contact your conference safety liaison, contact Nancy, contact myself. We can help, right? So that's really, really important. Like you may have a situation where you don't know quite what to do and you don't find a resource there or something specific to help with. So reach out to us. And I'll just give you an example and kind of how we approach this. So when the letter of the law isn't specific to a particular, like to use that moniker, if the letter of the law, quote unquote, is not specific to a particular situation you are encountering, what we will do is work to apply the spirit of the law, quote unquote, to that situation. And I'll just give you a really practical example. Let's say that a safe church policy and your safe church policies, your protection policies should say this. Let's say they say that there needs to be a window in every Sunday school classroom door. This is an actual thing that I've experienced in different churches. They say that you have to have a window in the classroom door, but the church has these beautiful solid wood doors, and they don't have the money to buy new doors, and they don't have the resources or desire to put windows in the ones they currently have. And so I've had people say, well, it says we have to do this, but we don't want to do this. Well, how would you address that situation? What do you do? Well, you look at the what we're trying to do with the guidelines. So for instance, if the purpose of the window is to make the space transparent and accountable, like so that people can see, people can walk by, what's happening in the room can be observable. That's the spirit of why you would want to do this. When that happens, so if that's the spirit, how can you make the space you're in actually accountable and transparent? That's what we talk about, accountable and transparent spaces. How do you do that? Well, we would help you think through that. What are some ways to do that? This one's a fairly simple one. You can actually leave the door open and that makes it solves the issue. So the letter might say put a window in, but you can actually leave the door open. And by the way, if there's smaller children in the classroom, you can put a gate or some other thing there so that you can actually be able to see. So this is how we go about like kind of solving these kinds of problems when you call or when you have challenges and it's not quite clear what to do. We find out what are we trying to accomplish? What are some other ways we can accomplish that? It's never about legalism. It's never about if you don't follow these things perfectly, then you're in trouble. It's none of that. That's not the spirit of what we do. So as we go and as we learn and as we live with this resource, just like any other resource, we will learn and the resource will grow with us. And so yeah, that's what it is. The other thing I want to say is that the spirit of this resource is not, and even the bylaw changes. The spirit is not that you better get this right, or somebody from the conference or the national office is going to come and tell you that you've done it wrong and you need to get things together and you're going to be in trouble. It's not that kind of thing where it's this top-down hierarchical kind of engagement with these kinds of resources. The spirit of this work is always, always, always collaborative, right? So congregation, conference, denomination, we're better together. We're in this together. We can learn from one another. And so that's always the spirit. It's not, this is how you do it, and if you don't do it this way, you're wrong. No, we work together in collaboration. And also this work is iterative, which means we do things and then we learn from it, and then we make changes and adjustments so that we can do it better as we continue to move. It's the beauty of this resource over and against kind of past policy documents that are kind of set it and then forget it for 10 years and then write a new one that you set and forget for 10 years. No, this is a living kind of document that we'll live with and we'll grow with, and we'll iterate and we'll make changes when that becomes necessary. And as we learn things, we'll improve. That's the way that we do this together, right? So hopefully that sets expectations. I know I've had these kinds of questions since we passed the bylaws. Does this mean that somebody from the national office is going to be policing what congregations do and how many people are in a classroom and if there's windows and what the nursery coverage is? No, that doesn't mean any of that. So we're going to give you resources, and there's resources out there, and there have been resources out there that have helped you with this. This is just the most recent version. Now let's jump into the resource itself. And I want to do that also with this caveat that each congregation is unique, as you know. Each congregation has various capacities, various levels of resources. We have very small congregations. We have quite large congregations. We have congregations that are run all by lay leaders or volunteer leaders. We have congregations with multiple staffs, paid staff, full-time staffs, all kinds of different capacities in those congregations. And also each congregation is at a different place on their journey with abuse prevention and accountability in the resources. For some people, they might be doing this as a congregation for maybe the last 20 years, the last 30 years, maybe even longer. For some, this might be new and they're just starting to pick up this work. So for some, you may have most, if not all of the things in the prevention and accountability resource, especially on the prevention side. You might have all of these things in place already, right? For others, you might just be starting out. And so tonight, for the rest of the time, I want to talk about where to start if your congregation is at the beginning of their journey, right? So this would be for people that are just starting to do this kind of work. Please know that like no congregation can do everything all at once, because it's really tempting to get a new policy. You look at the document, it's 86 pages long, and just become overwhelmed and think we have got to do all of this right now. It's not possible. If you tried to do it all right at once, you probably wouldn't do any of it well. So how do you begin to wade into this and begin to grow into the resource in a way that makes sense? So you can't do it everything at once. You have to start somewhere, and then you have to build on that. So where is the best place to start? Well, I would say this, like if I was new to this and I was fresh to this, I would start or say that there are actually three critical areas in the P&A resource for a congregation. The first one is protection policies, and that's kind of the baseline or the foundation for abuse prevention. Do we have protection policies? The second is effective pastoral supervision. which is really, really important. And then the third one is having congregational practices that lead to health, or good systems in the congregation that help to make the congregation healthy. All three of these are part of the prevention section of the prevention and accountability resource. They're all very, very important. So let's start with protection policies. This may be the thing that most people are most familiar with, right? And so these are policies and practices that help both educate congregation members to best practices, and also policies that put frameworks in place to help support the best practices. So what does it mean for us to be a congregation that cares for vulnerable, like minors and vulnerable adults? How do we approach that ministry? How do we ensure that they are safe? What parts of congregational life do we pay attention to because of that? What are the things that we make sure that we have to do, right? So protection policies will cover things like criteria, for instance, for volunteers with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Who can work with children, youth, and vulnerable adults? Can anybody? Is there any criteria for that? How do we vet people? How do we select people for ministry? How do we ensure that they're safe and can actually do these kinds of things well? Policies include things like background checks for all persons working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. So that's part of that vetting process. How do we ensure that we know that there's no history of abuse or misconduct in a person's background? Very, very important. It covers things very broadly, like facility safety. So how do we create a safe space? Especially how do we make sure our spaces allow for transparent and accountable ministry and relationships? Also, safe church or protection policy should have clear reporting processes that are regularly communicated to people, right? So the final thing then would be an administrative structure, these policy committee, who makes decisions, how do you update the policy, who in the church is responsible for this, for all the things we talked about. All of those things make up what we would call a protection policy or a safe church policy. And the only point I want to say at this point is, like, if you're a congregation, the first question I think you should ask is, do you have protection policies in place? And if you don't have them, this is where you start relative to prevention and accountability. You start by creating these policies, because if you don't have them, you will not have a structure in place to do these things. If you do have them and they're older than, let's say, 5 years or so, I think it's time to revisit them, because they should be revisited every now and again. And so there's already good resources at Mennonite Church USA website under Safe Church. Nancy Kauffmann does a lot with consulting local congregations on creation of policies that don't exist, actually reviewing policies or current policies on ways to improve them, and also education around things like circles of grace curriculum, other kinds of ways to educate congregation in church, in Safe Church. So all other things being equal, if you have these protection policies in place, great. If you don't have them, this is where you start. You start with that. The second area I think that's really critical in all of this, especially in the prevention aspect of the resource, is pastoral supervision. As a congregation, it is your responsibility to create a healthy context for pastoral ministry, and that involves clear expectations and accountability. Let's say you've never thought about that. It's pretty common for congregations to operate as informal systems, especially when we know each other. We've been around each other for a long time. Everybody kind of knows how the church works because we've grown there. We've been there for a long time. Those kinds of things make it easy to forget some of the basics around what it means to supervise effectively pastoral leaders, and especially in this, in the kind of accountability and expectations and ethics and misconduct related supervision. So I think the starting place for this area of life is to create a framework for pastoral supervision. And you'll find that in the prevention and accountability document starting on page 23. So pages 23 to 26, you'll want to go to think about this framework for pastoral supervision, because it is is really, really important. One of the things we know in terms of pastoral misconduct is that when pastors are not well supervised, when they don't have reasonable expectations and clear job descriptions, when they don't have proper supports and good compensation for the work, reasonable expectations, when those things are not present, it does make it more stressful for pastoral ministry. It makes it harder for them to work effectively over the long term, and it opens up possibilities for misconduct and for transgressions of boundaries in various relationships. So this is really, really important. And the starting place for this, again, is 23 to 26. And the first thing is maintaining clear and reasonable job descriptions for all pastors, ministers, ministerial leaders. And they need to be regularly updated and reflect current understandings. So you've got your protection policies in place. You look around and say, how's our pastors and ministers? What's their job descriptions? Are they accurate, clear, and regularly updated? If you do not have them, like if you say we don't actually have a job description to our pastor, that is the next thing you want to do before you do anything else, before you get into the weeds about a harassment policy or these kinds of things. If you don't, you do this. You need to actually have a clear, reasonable job description, and you'll do that in conversation with, in partnership with your pastoral leaders, and you need to have that in place. That's where you would start. So, well, let's say you have that. The next thing you would want to move to is using signed employment agreements. Like, this is different than a job description. This is signed by an agreement that's signed by both congregations and the pastor that indicates things like the FTE. Is this a full-time job? Is it a part-time job? What is the salary or compensation schedule? What are the benefits that you get? What is the term of service? How long is this? Like, do we have a 3-year term, or do we have a 5-year term? Is it an unending term? You need to have that all spelled out. You need to have provisions for extending employment, and you also need to have provisions for termination of employment. What happens when the relationship sours, and how, the ethics around that? How do you do that? Things like evaluation schedules. How often will I be evaluated? Who's going to do it? All of that needs to be actually contained in a signed employment agreement. So you have your clear and reasonable job description. Now you have a signed employment agreement. The next thing you would want to do is ensure that we believe this really strongly, that you follow MCUSA salary guidelines, and so that you can have a reasonable basis, a third party kind of neutral basis to determine like pastoral compensation, right? So one of the things we know is that pastors are under financial stress, when they're not well compensated and they're stressed out, it actually increases the likelihood that they might engage in financial malpractice, for instance, or some sort of financial boundary crossing, or some sort of boundary crossing around resources, even in dual relationships, some of these things. So it's really, really important that you get this nailed down as well. Like, that we're actually paying for the work we're asking people to do. We're paying them a fair labor value or market value for what it is that they are doing. That's extremely, extremely important. And then the last thing I would say on this one, there's more, but the last thing is that you do have to have clear administrative structures. And the big question is, who supervises the pastors, and how does the pastor communicate to the board, whoever it is that has oversight of the church? How do they report? What kind of things do you need to know about their schedule, what they're doing, how they're doing, those kinds of things. So you have protection policies. That's one place that you would jump in. If you don't have those, that's where you start. I would move then secondly to pastoral supervision and say, look, you need to get these things nailed down. Pages 23 and 26, that's the place that you would go next, and make sure that you have these things in place, and that you begin to just live into those structures and those relationships and agreements within the church. The next thing I would also say is that if you're an elder, if you're on the church board, if you have any oversight of pastors at all in your congregation, you need to become familiar with the Code of Conduct for Credentialed Leaders, which is on page 6 to 13 in the Prevention and Accountability Resource, and become familiar with Pastoral Ethics 14 through 19. And so once you have the foundation of supervision, all those kinds of nuts and bolts, you need to have a good working understanding of what is expected of pastoral leaders what is appropriate in terms of relationships with adult congregants, what's appropriate in terms of relationships, contact with minors in the congregation or children in the congregation. All of that is actually in the code of conduct for credentialed leaders and for pastoral ethics. So it's not just your pastors and credentialed leaders that need to read that and know that. You need to read that and know that. And the reason is we want, as the pastors know what they're expected, how they're expected to behave in terms of their relationship with others. It's really important that the congregation knows this as well, and that they're using the same system of evaluating whether a particular behavior is appropriate or inappropriate. We want that to be consistent across the whole of MCUSA and all the MCUSA area conferences and other congregations, so that we all understand these are things that are concerning behaviors for pastors. These are the things that are okay. And so that we're evaluating that using the same standard, we're evaluating that using the same codes and the same ethics, so that we have consistency across the system. One of the most unhelpful things historically has been when there are standards in place, for instance, for pastoral ethics, and yet when a congregation goes, well, we understand that, but we think that maybe the conference or the denomination's a little bit fussy about these things, and it's not that big of a deal to us. That can become really problematic system-wide, and it also can mean that in some cases, pastors will, it's the best way to say this, sometimes if somebody is going to try to transgress boundaries, they will start with small things and see how the system responds. And so somebody might start with a very small boundary crossing and see what happens. And if the church goes, well, that's not a big deal, they might go to a next one. And many times this is what the grooming process looks like, right? Over time, it escalates and they just see where the pushback, when is accountability going to come in, right? And so it's really important that we're all doing this in the same way. It's consistent across the system. And that if you hire a pastor, for instance, at First Mennonite Church in whatever town that came from a different conference and a different congregation, that they actually were using the same guidelines as well for what appropriate behavior is. So you really do need to be familiar with what the code of conduct and the pastoral ethics. And I think this will provide a foundation for what is acceptable and ethical pastoral behavior. And it'll help you understand what's a cause for concern, which means you can supervise better and more effectively. Again, I would say you don't have to memorize this section. There's not going to be a quiz. There probably won't ever be a test. But you need to understand it well enough to know that if there is a concerning behavior, that you recognize it, right? And the thing I would say here is what I would say with everything we're talking about. If you have concerns, even a little bit, even something that seems small to you, don't argue it out of sight. Don't argue it out of mind. Bring it up. Reach out sooner rather than later. Nancy, myself, your conference safety liaison, your conference ministers, we're here to help. We can provide kind of a neutral listening ear that can say, well, yeah, maybe that's not a big deal, or yeah, maybe that is a big deal, and maybe you should pay more attention to that. So when it comes to these concerns, reach out sooner rather than later. So again, I'm going to start with protection policies, and I'm going to move to pastoral supervision, including the structured piece, but also the familiarity with the covenant of conduct. So once you are familiar with those things, the third area I would say is what are some best practices for congregation, just in terms of overall congregational health. So this piece is about basic practices that a congregation can engage in that actually give you a better chance of being healthy together as a community. And all of those resources in the P&A resource will be on pages 20 to 23. So that's the part of this that we're looking at here. One way I like to think about this is almost like a healthy immune system. Like a healthy immune system in the body is present and active. That's looking for potential health to wealth, or to potential threats to health and wellness. And when it sees things when your immune system experiences things that they think might be a threat, they actually work to neutralize that potential impact on the whole. Now, what we don't need, of course, is an overactive immune system. We need a healthy immune system. And I think best practices for congregations are about that. It's about a healthy, present, and active paying attention to the things in the congregation, and the relationships and the relational fields, all these things. But not being an overactive immune system that sees everything as a threat, or any difference as a threat, or any minor thing as a threat that could, basically kill community life. It's not that. So we're looking to be kind of a healthy immune system. I'm assuming that everybody that's on this webinar, and maybe those that are watching, I'm assuming your church has a constitution. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that piece of it. But so this whole resource actually assumes that your church does have a basic constitution, articles of incorporation, clarifications on membership, has structures in terms of how decisions are made, who gets to make decisions, what decisions does the congregation make, what decisions can what decisions can the elders make, what authority do pastors have, so that you have that basic framework that's in a constitution. Like, it's not the most exciting part of church life, right? To really dig into the Constitution. And yet it does provide a scaffolding or a framework for how you govern your life together, in the basics of church life together. So if you don't have a Constitution, I would say, in the area of church health, you need to start there, because you do need to have good, clear decision-making policies and processes that show up in a Constitution, and who gets to decide what, when, where, and how. If you don't have that, do start there. Probably the best thing to do would be to call us or call your conference minister, and we can help you if you don't know quite where to start. But assuming you have that, when it comes to the prevention and accountability resource, where we'd like you to start is developing what we would call a congregational behavioral covenant. And so this is a covenant that outlines what healthy community behavior looks like in your church. Like, what does it mean? How are we going to relate to one another? This is something that should flow out of your values. It should reinforce practices that support those values. How do we create an open environment where people can be heard and listened to? How do people talk to church leaders? How do they get in contact with them? How do they share things with the elder board? How do they meet with the pastor? What happens like with congregations? How should we treat one another? Even simple things like, what's our posture as a community on things like gossip, and how do we then deal with those kinds of community life issues that really do these behaviors that can make a community healthy, help it thrive, or one that can make it really difficult, especially for pastoral leaders and other leaders that are then having to manage that conflict. So the behavioral covenant is where I would start, a covenant that outlines these things. It should also include a conflict resolution process, right? So when two or more parties disagree in the community, how do you deal with that? Very, very important for conflict resolution. But more than that, you should have a very clear misconduct or grievance process in the church. And so this is different than a conflict resolution process. A conflict resolution process happens or is enacted when there's two or more parties that are in disagreement about something. Misconduct or grievance process is about, what do we do when somebody in the community does something that hurts another person in the community? That's when, how do they talk about that? Who do they talk to about that? How do you reconcile that? Who do they report to? How do they report? You should have misconduct and grievance processes. And again, this is something that's on page 20 to 23, and that talks about it in P&A. So you need to have those things. So if I'm looking at this, 60 or 86 page document, and I'm thinking as a congregation, the bylaws now say that I have to use these guidelines. I don't quite know where to begin. Like, the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So which bite do you take off first? This is how I would prioritize it. The first thing is protection policies, starting with guidelines for volunteers, background check systems, and facility safety plans. These are the things that you need to have in place. When those things are in place, the second thing you would want to tackle is supervision practices, starting with clear job descriptions for your pastor and your ministers or anybody that's in a ministerial context. The third thing then I would say is start looking at best congregational practices. Assuming there's a solid constitution, start with this member behavior covenant. What does it mean for us to be community together? What expectations do we have for one another? And how do those things help us to achieve our vision for community that we have, a real positive vision for what it means? Essentially, I would say until you have all of those three basic systems in place, it won't matter too much if you have a good non-discrimination policy or a great harassment and abuse policy or a really well-worded social media policy. And the reason is that if you don't have those essential systems in place, you won't have the framework in your community at all to deal with any of the violations of these other policies when they happen, right? So you have to have a healthy community that can actually respond to, say, a pastor that steps over a boundary. You need to have a healthy congregation in order to deal with that well, right? So it's really important to have the basic systems down, and then you can move into other things. And so what is key, I think, in all of this is that you have a healthy community where people are shaped by your deepest values and willing to be accountable for living out those values in community. They're willing to be accountable to one another. To me, this is Anabaptism 101. We commit our lives to following Jesus. We commit to do it in community together. We discern the scriptures together in their application, and we commit to mutual submission in the body, where we give and receive counsel to one another. You can have all the policies in the world, and if people do not follow them or respond in a healthy way when there's a transgression of those policies, they do not matter very much, right? So you got to start with the basics. Now, let's say you have all of that in place. You're sitting there going, Mike, we've done this. We're great. We got all this kind of stuff. But there's a few things on this policy checklist, page 28 through 30, that we'd love to get to. I agree that these are really, very important. That's why they're in the resource, and why this policy checklist is there. These are things that you should have. If you don't have them, you need to work on them. Let's say you between pages 28 and 30, you don't have any of those things in place. This would be my recommendation for what I would do first. The first thing I would do is get a confidentiality policy. And this has to do with health in the congregation and how you deal with interpersonal information that you have in your relationships together. This could be congregants to congregants, but also what do pastors and leaders do with information they might have about church members, and how do they handle that in a proper way? What are the expectations for how that is handled, how that information is shared or not shared? I would start there. That's fairly foundational, and there needs to be a lot of clarity. There's a lot of conflict that can happen, and even misconduct cases that spring out of different understandings about expectations around shared information, right? So if you are saying something to your pastor and your expectation is that it's confidential, but they don't understand it that way and they share it with someone else, there can be a lot of hurt feelings that happen in those contexts. So I would start with a good confidentiality policy. I think right next to it, or fairly close to it, is a non-discrimination policy for all hiring. And some of that will depend on the size of the church. If you're a church that is all volunteers, that won't make a lot of sense. It won't be the next priority. But if you're a larger, like multi-staff church that has a lot of volunteers and a lot of people that you're hiring, that's really, really important. The third thing then I would get to very quickly is the harassment and abuse policy that also contains the whistleblower protection policy. So how do we ensure that if there's a process in place to report a grievance, that what are the protections for persons when they do that? What's the risk of doing that, and have that pretty well spelled out. This is what that looks like. And then I would certainly say an acceptable use policy for church Wi-Fi and social media in today's context, given the smartphones, the proliferation of smartphones, and how that technology can and cannot be used. Various folks are in and around the church. There's samples we have samples of some of these policies already online. We have new samples for these policies coming online and being, as we create them, they're being uploaded as well. And if you have those also that you said, man, ours is fantastic, we would love to share those with other people. So our catalog of sample policies cannot be too big, because it's pretty easy digitally to store those and link to them and let people see them and use them. So this is where it is really helpful in terms of collaboration to to have a community working together and saying, well, this is how we tackled this, and this is how, the sample that we use, this is how we got to where we're going. And if you have questions about any of those things, we're here to serve you in that way and to begin to help you with those. So that's just a real kind of brief. This is an 86 page document, but I would encourage you not to be too overwhelmed by the size, but just to think through, how do you enter into starting to live with this in the spirit of growth, trying stuff out, doing this in community, using the resources at the conference and at the national level. So with that, I think we're going to shift gears and we are going to answer some questions that came in prior that were submitted as you guys registered, and then I think maybe, we'll go.
Yeah, there's a couple that come in since we started, and you can continue to ask questions if you have more on the question and answer. But I'm going to start, Michael, by taking the questions that have come in already, and some of these you have answered in some ways or in some shape or form. But anyway, the first question that was sent to us is this a resource already available online?
Yes, the short answer to that is yes, it is already available online. It was first placed online in June, I think, of 2025, maybe mid-June, as a delegate resource as they were considering the bylaw change, but it's now available on the Safe Church section of MCUSA's website. If you go to MennoniteChurchUSA.org, click on ministries, one of the things you'll see is Safe Church. When you click on that, it will open up the landing page for all the Safe Church ministries, and you'll see prevention and accountability on the right-hand side there, and all the other resources, background checks, other things, that all the stuff that Safe Church offers. Circles of Grace curriculum is there, all these kinds of things. So those are all available online.
And that list will continue to grow as we continue to develop. We even have a Showalter grant to help us develop some of those resources. So keep checking that website. Next question is, they're interested in resources that can help church boards better manage their pastors.
Yeah, so I'd say two things. One, every year I actually do teach a 4-session workshop at AMBS, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, entitled Effective Church Boards. Those 4 sessions, one whole session of that is actually how to effectively supervise pastors. I've also taught in the last 2 conventions, actually, a seminar on effective supervision of pastors, and I've taught that in actually a couple of local congregations as well that have requested that. So, I would be happy to engage anyone on that topic. It's something I'm passionate about, and something I've done a lot of work with, and then a lot of teaching and working with pastors on as well. I don't think it's possible. We did flag it as a potential webinar topic, which I think we might be able to do. We pull out the one course the one session that's in the 4-week course, and actually do that as a one-off free webinar. So I think in 2026 we'll see that happen. So, but if you need assistance with that before then, I don't know if Cammy's put our emails up on the chat or not, but so there's an article, and the article and then slides that I've used for that webinar, or that teaching seminar is available online, and so you can also reach out to me.
Well, and also for those of you, we do have done a number of trainings and consultations by Zoom. So if you're far away, but you would like to have, us come into your boardroom or whatever, that we would be available for that. Another question that was given to us is, what is MCUSA's plan to hire staff to begin stewarding this policy?
Yeah, so great question. I would say my first response is we've already been stewarding the policy and also its predecessors through MCUSA staff for a while. This policy is unique from where we were because the administrative structure for this, in terms of who stewards this in the life of the church, is actually done collaboratively through area conferences and national MCUSA staff. And so um, every once in a while I hear people say, like, they'll say, oh, well, this all the misconduct and accountability is actually shifting to the national office. That's actually not true. That's kind of a mischaracterization of the new administrative structure. This will be stewarded by staff volunteers, depending on the conference, at the conference level through conference safety liaisons, of which we'll have one per conference that tends to this in the life of their conference, and then it's stewarded at the national level through national level staff. And currently we're staffed at one point, like one FTE for Safe Church specifically. And we've just completed a new hire for a director, which we'll announce shortly, and some other things there. But there are no plans to add more national staff necessarily, beyond what our current FDA commitment is. But part of the work of the person at the national level will be to what's the best way to curate this kind of community of shared support through conference safety liaisons at the conference level. So that's a quick answer, or not so quick.
Okay, the next question is, how do we make this long, complex document into a living, relevant part of the congregation instead of a policy on a shelf?
I feel like that's a great question, actually. As soon as I read it, I'm like, this is a great question. And I would say the short answer is by using them. The quickest answer is, well, yeah, if you use them, they'll become living and active. And if you don't use them, they'll sit on the shelf and collect dust. For those of you, I don't know who's all on this webinar, but I was a congregational pastor for 20 plus years before becoming a conference minister. And I can say as a congregational pastor that during that time, there were various resources, initiatives, programs, and policies that either came from the area conference or from the national body. I don't know where you sit on some of this stuff, but I found some of them were very relevant to what we were doing in the life of the church, and others not so much. But for the ones that were, and the ones that were really important to our connection to the wider community and our responsibilities to the area conference, other congregations, and the national body, I always saw it as part of my responsibility as pastor to make sure that these relative initiatives were living relevant parts of our congregational life. And what I've noticed as both a pastor and as a conference minister, and even in my current role, is that pastors are often the connecting point between the church denomination and persons in the pews in the local church. Most people that come to, we're the ones that have our ear to the ground a bit more about what's happening at the national level, and then we have to translate that or make that available to people in the local church. So I'm not trying to say it's all the pastor's responsibility, but I think pastors are key to making sure these kinds of things are actually living and vibrant through their use in the life of the church. Now, the other thing I'll say, because I have a little bit of a contrarian streak, I'll just say this. I don't actually think this document's as long and complex as it may appear, right? So if you say, like, this is an 80-page document that I have to know inside and out, it may seem daunting because that is a lot. But actually, if you get to know the structure of it and what the resources are, and you lean into the content of the resource itself, it really is a catalog of resources, which you will engage at various points depending on your needs and your context, right? If you're a congregational lay leader, there's parts of this that will be relevant, but other parts you will never have to deal with, right? If you're a conference safety liaison, however, you better know the accountability process because you're part of the response team. So depending on where you're at and what your role is and what your responsibility is in the church, you'll interact with parts of this in a really, really helpful ways, and other parts of it you may never see or experience or know. Just know that it's there. So if there is a question, say about a misconduct related process, the resource is there and available to you for you to see. We're not hiding how we do this work, but at the same time, it's not all directly relevant to every leader in the church. And so if you break it up into smaller pieces, and that's why what I tried to do even in this webinar is to say, well, if I'm a congregation leader, I'm not a credentialed leader, but I have some sort of oversight in the church. this is where I would start with these things that are in the P&A resource. So yeah. Hope that helps. I don't know.
And one little thing I would add, often when we talk about the safe church policies in a congregation, what often happens is the congregation will develop it and then put it on this shelf until they actually need it. And then the congregation forgets that there is such a policy. So I think, education and training to constantly help our congregational members understand what it means to be a healthy congregation, to have healthy relationships, and that keeping that in front of the congregation helps.
Yeah. So yeah, that can be even a habit, right? Whenever something comes up that's related to abuse prevention, it's related to accountability, it's related to pastoral ethics or healthy congregations, go to the resource first and see what's there. If you have a protection policy, go there first if it's dealing with abuse and those kinds of things, and then go from there.
Mm-hmm. Another question I want to know specifically about an acceptable use policy for church-wide Wi-Fi. How do we do that?
Yeah, I think great question. I have to admit, when I read it, there's a couple of ways to take or to understand the question. So the first way might be like, how do we write a policy like that? And so we do have like a sample acceptable use policy that's in the process of being uploaded online. If this is your question and you need this, like immediately send me an email and I'll send you the sample. I can just send it to you as a document. So if that's the issue, how do we write it? What kind of things should it contain? We have a sample policy that you can use. And there's others that you can get also available online from other congregations as well. So, but I think that's, if you're talking about what should be in it, that would be one of the ways to start. And so really, like these kind of things should be, acceptable uses, prohibited, like things you have to really cover would be acceptable use, like what are acceptable uses of Wi-Fi, but also prohibited activities. What things can't you do on our network? Privacy and monitoring. What do you do with information if somebody's using their phone through the church Wi-Fi? Security, different things of that nature would be covered in that kind of a policy. If the question is how do we enact one in the life of the community, that's a little bit different too. Like, so once you have a policy, how do you get people to sign it, agree to it? How do you approach it that way? In general, I would just recommend that you do that the same way you would enact any other kinds of policies in your church. But when it comes to acceptable use policies relative to Wi-Fi, the easiest way to get people to accept them is actually on the tech side of things, so that when somebody logs on to your church Wi-Fi, before they can get access to the Wi-Fi, they actually have to accept by clicking, by an action, the acceptable use policy before they can get access to the Wi-Fi. Pretty common in almost any public Wi-Fi setting where you have to actually click onto an acceptable use policy and do that action. There's tech ways to do that, and some of them can be quite simple. Some of them could be more complicated depending on the architecture of your website. For instance, if it's a WordPress site, it's pretty easy to do with a plugin. If it's a custom coded site, then you'll need to probably pay someone to help you figure out how to do that. But it's not that difficult to do. But if that's what we're dealing with, then that would be, and maybe it's all of that. You develop the policy, you get it approved by the particular leaders in the church, and then you make it as something that someone has to accept before they can log on. That is the best way to do that. In a community like a church, it might be good to have a bit of time teaching or sharing time with congregants in a Sunday school class or another open forum where you're walking people through it. Why do you have the kinds of things in the policy that you want, and how that reinforces your commitments to one another and who you want to be as a congregation together. Every time we can tie things back to that, we're winning in terms of creating a healthy community. So I don't know if that answered the question. It's hard to know sometimes on this side of things.
Okay, I have at least 4 questions that came in through the Q&A. Oh, now there's another one. But one is, the question is, under response team, it says the response team can consult with legal counsel for clarity on what to report to local authorities. Does MCUSA have a lawyer on call?
Yes. Yes, we do.
Okay. Then the next one that's sort of similar is under response team. It also says to connect victims with professional trauma informed care. Does MCUSA pay for that care?
So that would really depend on the context, as to who might help facilitate or pay for that care, right? So it could be MCUSA, it could be, depending on the context, it could be the congregation, could be a partnership between congregation, conference, MCUSA. So that would be like on a case by case basis. I can say that our commitment would be that if somebody needs professional trauma informed care, that we would not let finances be an obstacle to them getting the care they needed. So, yeah.
Okay. Another question, it says that the response team, along with the MCUSA, will retain an independent investigator regarding certain kinds of claims of abuse. Who would that be?
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, I'm looking at it here. So, yeah, so if we are hiring an independent investigator, it'll track with the nature of the claim that we're investigating. So if it's a sexual misconduct in place in the church, we'll work with people like Grace, who actually do professional investigations in religious contexts. If it's, let's say that the issue is financial mismanagement that requires forensic accounting, we would retain a person. We have resources for that. So it really depends on the nature of the claim itself, but it'll scale to the nature of the allegation. For sexual abuse cases, our preferred partner at this point is to work with Grace.
Another question that came in is, this policy seems aimed at addressing abuse perpetrated by someone in an obvious clergy pastoral role. How might we address abuse perpetrated by someone in a role like a committee? Should they be treated the same or similarly to a pastor?
I have to admit, I was reading a different question as you were reading that one, so I got a little bit distracted. Yeah, so that is a fantastic question, and it's one we get a lot. And the challenge is that that outside of credentialed leaders or those in ministerial roles, the national body and the conference really don't have any account. The people in the church don't have any congregation don't have necessarily any accountability to other structures in the church, so the conference or the denomination. And so what we would do is walk alongside the congregation and helping them walk through that particular issue within the church. I do think they should have the same standards of care that others would have in the church. But it's really, really important that you have a pretty clear protection policies, because that is what would apply to them. And also things like a behavioral covenant that they can use. So so these resources kind of would work, at least my understanding is that they work in partnership with one another. In terms of the standards we expect, yes, I would think they would be the same, but they are a little bit different context in terms of pastoral power. Yeah.
Yeah, we have one more question. That was probably the one that you were reading. I jumped ahead. But anyway, it says, is there going to be a way to make the P&A resource more accessible to navigate? Will there be a copy edited to correlate the table of contents in the body of the resource to correct section numbers and add page numbers? They want more editing.
Yep, great question. Yep, I'm glad to. I see who's asked the question. Be glad to talk to you about that. But yeah, so any recommendations you have for making it more accessible and navigatable right from the table of contents, yes, let me know, and we'll engage that.
Okay, well, that's the last question I want to emphasize. Thank you, Michael, for all that you have done to help us understand this policy better. And you had said something earlier, and I want to highlight that if you as your congregation have a good policy of any one of these things that we've talked about, and you are willing to share it, please let us know, because we are trying to develop a list of samples so that we don't all have to reinvent the wheel on this. But we do need to do the good work within our congregation so that our congregation understands why we're doing this work. I want to thank everybody who has attended this webinar, and then also the ones who will be listening to it later. I know that there will be some who have said they will be listening to it later because they couldn't be here this evening. But I do want to give you a blessing as you go on, just to remember you are not alone. We are all in this together. Please reach out, and we will continue to develop resources. So pray that God blesses your desire, your efforts in your local setting as you continue to work to help strengthen your congregation to be as healthy as it can be. May God strengthen your heart and your mind as you continue on this good work. Blessings to you all, and good night.